Hello everybody, Simon Whiteley here. This is just a quick video to share a little bit of work I've done on the recent Air Canada incident at San Francisco Airport, where essentially the aircraft landed on the runway when they were specifically told to go around by the air traffic controllers. So what I've done is I've taken a newspaper article from the internet and I've decomposed it on my iPad using an app called Liquid Text. And then I'll show you exactly how I've created this control structure you can see behind me, and then I'll talk about it. Okay, so what I've done is I've imported the Mercury News article that was posted on LinkedIn by a friend and colleague called Shem Marmquest. Thanks, Shem. I've imported that article into this app called Liquid Text, which is an iPad app, and it essentially allows you to drag text from the subject that you're looking at onto what's called a workspace, and it allows you to arrange your notes in an order. And I find it's a really quick, easy way to extract information from a source and then arrange it in a rough hierarchy, a rough control structure, and then I can use that as a basis to then start developing the actual control structure I'll use for a CAST or an STPA analysis. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly go through this report, extract pertinent information, show you how I arrange it on a version 1 of the control structure, and then I'll talk about it in a bit more detail. Okay, so this is a Mercury News article. The headline, just before we begin, says, "Again, FAA investigates another Air Canada landing mix-up at SFO." So straight away the headline presumes that Air Canada has made a mistake, and it's basically all their fault, so it points fingers at it, and I don't think it's really appropriate at this early stage of the investigation to be that sort of controversial. Okay, so just 3 months after an Air Canada plane nearly landed on a taxiway crowded with jets full of passengers, the FAA has launched another investigation into why a plane from the same airline Sunday ignored a San Francisco air traffic controller's repeated order to abort a landing. So I'm just going to drag these elements out because they're relevant. So they've got an investigation to do. This is a San Francisco air traffic controller, and the aircraft. So the air traffic controller was in control of the aircraft, but the aircraft ignored the San Francisco controller's repeated order to abort a landing. So if we were to just draw a basic quick control structure, what we would be talking about is basically this interaction. So the air traffic controller is in charge of the plane, and there's a feedback there, and the air traffic controller issues an abort for landing, and for whatever reason the aircraft didn't respond. So that's the basic, very basic control loop that we're talking about here. So let's dig into that a bit more. Let's look at it in a bit more detail. And I'm just getting used to using this app, so I do apologise. Okay, so Air Canada Flight 781. So Air Canada Flight 781, it's an Airbus A320, that might be important, was preparing to land at San Francisco International Airport on runway 28 right on Sunday night. After a 6-hour flight from Montreal, the crew acknowledged the tower's clearance to land when it was 6 miles from the airport. So just looking at this simple control loop then, so this on the left hand side was the control action by the air traffic controller, and on the right hand side is the feedback loop to the air traffic controller. So before the air traffic controller issued the repeated order to abort landing, they actually gave a clearance to land when it was 6 miles from the airport. So let's just put that in there and think about it. And the crew acknowledged the tower's clearance to land. So that's the feedback loop there on the other side. And obviously this is just a very, quick and dirty, example of extracting information that's pertinent to a control structure CAST-based analysis. Okay, so as the airplane approached, an air traffic controller repeated 6 times that the Air Canada pilot should execute go around. So that was repeated 6 times, this particular one here. Okay. The Air Canada pilot should execute a go around an aborted landing where the plane pulls up and circles around to approach again. There was no response, so there was no feedback in that situation. So for whatever reason, the crew did not provide that response to air traffic control. And there was no response according to an air traffic control radio recording reviewed by Bay Area News Group. So it may be that there was a response, but it wasn't captured in the radio recording. I don't know, because I'm not part of the investigation. So let's just put that to one side. The air traffic control radio recording essentially records the radio links between, essentially, across that area there and area there. It basically records that information. So it's an absolutely critical. If you're going to do an investigation, that information is absolutely critical and should be protected. Okay, the tower ordered the go around because it was not certain if an earlier arriving plane had fully cleared the runway. So this suggests information about the mental model or process model of the air traffic controller. So they behaved and said, abort the landing, because they were not certain if an earlier arriving plane had cleared the runway. So that's important information. The Air Canada crew did not acknowledge any of the controller's instructions. So we've said that there. As the plane got closer to landing, a tower supervisor used a red light gun to alert the crew to abort the landing. So that's a control action by the air traffic control. So let's fit that in there. I know it looks like a bit of a mess at the moment, but as I say, this is the first stage, extracting information and trying to understand the context. So this is on the control action side. So let me just sort of be clear. So this is the control action side of the. So this is the controller in charge of the control process, which is the Air Canada plane, and this is the control action side, and then this side is the feedback side, part of the feedback loop. So that's what we're looking at here there. That's the basic control loop that we're talking about. Okay, so a flashing light gun is standard protocol when an aircrew is not responding to radio instructions. So this standard protocol, I'm going to drag that out because that is potentially in the higher part of the control structure over and above the air traffic controller. Now let me just, looks like a bit of a mess at the moment. It will become clearer, trust me. Let's put that to one side. So there's an air traffic controller and there is an air traffic or tower supervisor. So they're sort of higher up in the hierarchy of this control structure. So I'm going to put them in there above the air traffic controller. And obviously this is just a news article, a news report. It's not a proper investigation report. So these details, may be reported inaccurately, and so the structure I'm building is based only on that source of information. And you watching this, if you're an expert, you might be able to add more detail to this than I am able to. Okay, so however, despite all those efforts from the tower, the Air Canada plane still landed on runway 28 right at 9:26 p.m. Fortunately, radar showed that after the fact, the Southwest Airlines jet that the tower had feared was still on the runway, had actually cleared the area. So there was some radar data which basically gave information about the runway status. So let's put that to one side. There's an interaction between the radar and the air traffic controller which prompted them to not be certain if the aircraft had cleared the runway. So the tower feared was still on the runway. There we go. So let's put that in there. That's relevant information. After it landed, the Air Canada crew alerted the tower it had a radio problem. So this is the feedback loop, so let's put that in there. That's pretty evident. The air traffic controller told the flight crew, so that's in that side of the control loop. The controller then guided the plane to the proper taxiway according to the radio recording. So let's put that in there. So that's a control action. Okay. So just to be clear, these two lines are just to highlight the main control loop that we're talking about. The FAA is investigating the incident. The NTSB and Transportation Safety Board of Canada are aware of the incident but are not investigating. See, that's interesting because basically if this incident has occurred, if you have a near miss, that is an indication that the control structure is inadequate to enforce the high-level safety constraints. And so if you have a near miss, it is essentially a precursor warning that something's not right with your control structure and that you should investigate it and do something about it. Not just sit back and then wait for the next one and trend these incidents. It's telling you today that there's an issue, go and look into it. Okay, so they're aware of the incident but not investigating. The official Air Canada Twitter account have initially sent a tweet to this reporter after a story about the incident first appeared online, appearing confused about what happened. By Tuesday, Air Canada released a statement declining to comment on whether the flight crew was disciplined or whether it involved the same pilot or co-pilot involved as the incident 3 months ago. The airline also declined to say whether the flight crew had been disciplined. I mean, my perspective on that is if I was the Air Canada safety manager, personally I'd call all the media into a press conference and I'd give them a dressing down and basically say, look, we haven't completed the investigation. We are not going to talk about whether the flight crew has been disciplined or not. The investigation hasn't been completed. We operate a just culture where we need to understand what's happened, what the context was, and understand people's behaviour. And then if it is absolutely necessary, because somebody has broken a rule or a regulation, then we may well discipline them. But the point of all of this, for the safety of our passengers, our paying public, is to understand what happened so that we can prevent it from happening again. The focus should not be on assigning blame to the flight crew or anybody else. The focus should be on finding out what happened and understanding it so we can prevent it from happening again. Okay, so after receiving proper clearance to land, so it proceeded to do so and land normally. So that's that bit there, so we'll just stick that on there. So they got clearance to land, so that as far as the Air Canada flight crew were concerned, they had clearance to land. It was a valid clearance and they were carrying on with it. Okay. Air Canada spokesman. Okay, so upon landing, the crew was informed that the tower had attempted unsuccessfully to contact the aircraft. So this was down this side of the control structure. And however, the message was not received by the crew. Air Canada is investigating the incidents. So the message was not received by the crew. So that suggests then that there's an issue on this side of the control loop. So is it that there's a problem with the radio communications on the aircraft? Is it that there's a problem with the radio communications in the tower? Or where is it? That's the sort of main question that as part of the investigation should be hunted down. Air Canada is investigating the circumstances. Well, that's brilliant. Brilliant, Air Canada. Carry on, get that stuff done. Because ultimately you don't want this kind of stuff happening again. And if it's an issue with your aircraft, your equipment, your procedures, then you can deal with it. But ultimately this incident is more than just Air Canada's responsibility. There is a bigger system there, as I'm hoping you can see from this control structure diagram. Okay, spokesman for Air Canada's Pilots Union said that the flight crew experienced a communications failure after being cleared for landing. So I'm just going to highlight the Air Canada's Pilots Union, just to highlight that there is another entity potentially involved or relevant to this control structure. The flight crew experienced a communications failure, so let's just put that to one side. So there's the aircraft, there's the flight crew in control of that aircraft. So you can see I'm arranging the hierarchy. The plane is at the bottom. I would argue that you could probably put runway 28 in there, like this, and then the other aircraft on there as well, so I'll come back to that in a moment. Okay, so specifics regarding the nature of the communication failure are under investigation by the FAA. The aircraft landed safety and preliminary information indicates the incident posed no risk to the aircraft passengers or crew. The flight crew is working with the FAA to determine what transpired. Retired commercial airline pilot Ross Amos said that the incident left him shaking his head. So that first line's interesting. Is it that he's shaking his head positively or negatively, or what's the situation? Excuse me. Pilots must exercise extreme caution to make sure the runway is cleared of the previously landing traffic, he said in an email. In this case, because Southwest did not exit the runway in time, Air Canada should have promptly gone around, even without the controller telling them what to do. Radio discipline is extremely important as well. If one radio goes silent for any reason, there are other radios that they can quickly switch to. Okay, so this is highlighting some high-level safety constraints that apply to this control structure. So first off, the pilots must exercise extreme caution to make sure the runway is clear of the previously landing traffic. Excellent. Okay. So that's related to the flight crew, that control action, that safety constraint. Now there is also an equivalent safety constraint that applies to the air traffic controller, the tower supervisor. So let's just highlight those to make it clear that they're the controllers that we're talking about. Southwest is presumably the other aircraft that was on the runway, and that it did not exit the runway in time. So why was that? Why did it not exit the runway in time? And why did the air traffic controller give clearance to this aircraft, the Air Canada aircraft, to land if the runway was not clear? We need to understand that from an investigation perspective. Air Canada should have promptly gone around, even without the controller telling them what to do. So that's another safety constraint. Action in the event of. So the question to the flight crew is, well, why didn't they go around? Why was their mental model such that there was no issue? Is it that they didn't see the other aircraft still on the runway, bearing it was night time? Or is it that they thought they did see the other aircraft, but they thought they had sufficient time to land without there being any danger? And is that in addition to the apparent radio communications failures? Radio discipline is extremely important as well. Okay, so radio discipline is associated with the flight crew's control algorithm and mental model. So how good are they at using the radios? And then if one radio goes silent for any reason, there are other radios that they can quickly switch to. So this is a mitigation for radio issues. But the question there is, you know, given that this happened in a critical stage of flight, is it really appropriate to presume that the flight crew can actually mitigate issues with radios by switching radios in such a critical phase of flight? You know, because at the end of the day, the standard, you know, aviation tagline, if you like, is to aviate, navigate and communicate. And so if they're really busy aviating and trying not to crash into the ground, they haven't really got time to mess around with the radio. So the question then is it that the radio communications for this particular part of the flight envelope, is it really appropriate for real-time safety critical communications of, in this case, the go-around command? And I'm not convinced it is. I mean, we talk about the red light gun being used, and obviously that was not effective, so why was that? Okay, in an airport as busy as SFO, Amos said he'd check his radio if he did not hear anything from the tower for more than 30 seconds. So this is a potential mitigation for issues with the radios. Again, is this standard procedure that this chap is talking about, or is it that he personally would do that and that the flight crew should have done that, and if they had, it would have been effective? You know, again, this is a mitigation for a radio issue, but we don't necessarily know whether the flight crew knew there was an issue with the radio before they attempted to land. It's clear that they knew afterwards because they said that. They said, we've alerted the tower, we've had a radio problem. Okay, the tower even used the old-fashioned red light signal as a backup, but these guys were clueless. So he's made an assumption there that the air crew either did see the red light signal and ignored it, or that perhaps they were just incompetent, which isn't, that's basically blaming people without actually thinking about the larger systemic factors. And Shem Malmquist, 777 pilot. So Shem is a colleague and friend of mine. He's the chap who posted this article on LinkedIn, which I'm now reviewing. Thanks, Shem. So Shem said it was not surprising that the flight crew failed to see the light gun, which is transmitted from the airport control tower, because the SFO tower is so far from the runway. Right, okay, so that's an important aspect, that they failed to see the light. I mean, we don't know if they definitely did fail to see the light. We could argue that they did. We don't necessarily know that. That should be established as part of the investigation. But as Shem said, it's such a long way from the tower, it's highly likely that that is the case. So let's just put a note there. So, I mean, this aspect is related to the red light gun there. So is it that is an effective control action? Well, clearly it's not in this case. It didn't save the day. It didn't prevent it from happening. In over 40 years of flying, the only time I've ever seen one was when I asked to demonstrate the system for a student pilot, Malmquist said in an email. It would only be noticeable if the pilot was looking towards the tower and absent knowing they would need to. Doing so would add potentially dangerous distraction to an already critical phase of flight. So we've talked about it being a critical phase of flight. We're talking about whether it's reasonable that the aircrew would look towards the tower, and it's not necessarily clear that they'd know that they'd need to look to the tower to expect a light gun signal. So that's suggesting that, it's an inappropriate mitigation for providing a go-around command, if you like. Sunday's incident follows a stunning July the 7th near collision involving the same airline, airport and runway. Okay. In that episode, Air Canada Flight 7959 mistook a crowded taxiway for runway 28 right and flew as low as 59 feet off the ground before the pilot aborted his landing, flying dangerously close to 4 other aircraft awaiting takeoff with an estimated 1,000 passengers on board all the planes, according to an ongoing NTSB investigation. The flight crew later told investigators it thought the taxiway was actually their intended runway. Aviation experts have said that near miss could have triggered one of the worst aviation disasters in history. Officials did not officially report the incident, which allowed the cockpit voice recorder to be overwritten. Federal investigators also determined that the Air Canada plane dropped off the air traffic controller's ground surveillance system radar during its final 12 seconds on approach. Since the close call, the FAA no longer allows visual approaches for aircraft approaching SFO at night, with an adjacent parallel runway closed, according to the FAA. Instead, they must use instruments to land in the tower. The FAA now also requires 2 controllers to remain in a position during busy late night hours, the agency has said. Right, so that's with regards to the previous July the 7th incident with another Air Canada aircraft, where the aircraft approached and was trying to land on the taxiway adjacent to the runway 28 right. Now, I'm probably going to do a separate video on that, but it's interesting that the FAA no longer allows visual approaches for aircraft approaching SFO at night, with an adjacent parallel runway closed. So I'm just wondering, and I don't know because I haven't checked, I'm just wondering if the airport is still operating with the other runway closed, and that this FAA requirement to not do a visual approach means that the aircrew were head in. And perhaps that's why potentially they didn't see the other aircraft on the runway and then execute a go-around themselves. So there's some interesting questions there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go and draw this control structure on my whiteboard and show you 2 different views of the control structure. I'll show you a very simple one that I've highlighted here with the ultimate controller here and the control process down here, and then the control actions and feedback loop. I'll draw those on the board, and then I'll draw you a more complicated control structure to look at some of the other dimensions. Okay, so what I've drawn here is essentially just the basic control loop. At the top we've got the air traffic controller, and at the bottom we've got the aircraft movement. So that's the physical process that this whole control structure is intended to control. And so the aircraft movement is obviously due to the aircraft and its movement, and the flight crew controls the aircraft. So notionally, the air traffic controller controls the aircraft movement via the flight crew and their control of the aircraft. So now this one is essentially a development of the first one, and it includes the tower supervisor and their use of the red light gun, and then the other aircraft, so in this case the Southwestern aircraft. And now I've developed it and included the radar feed to the air traffic controller, and I've also included the cockpit voice recorders on both aircraft and the radio channel recorder, the ATC radio channel recorder. Now the reason I've included those is because I just want to make the point and emphasise that especially in a near-miss situation, it is absolutely critical that that information is captured as part of the investigation. And so in the case of past events where it hasn't been a formal accident investigation, so they haven't bothered to store the cockpit voice recorder information, my view is that in every incident they should store that cockpit voice recorder information, because once it's destroyed, the opportunity to learn from this near miss is totally lost. So it's really important. And with regards to the radar as well, I've included that on there, but I don't have any information from the newspaper report to be able to comment on the interactions there. That's what those question marks are. So all I've added now is the control algorithm and mental model aspects of both sets of flight crew and the air traffic controller. So I've included specifically for the flight crew the control algorithm and mental model, because for the Air Canada crew, their mental model must have been that the runway is clear, otherwise why would the air traffic controller give them a clearance? Now obviously their mental model could not be updated for whatever reason when the air traffic controller told them to perform a go around. So we need to understand why their mental model wasn't updated, or if it was, if they did know that they should do a go around, why they didn't do a go around. So that would be part of the investigation. And then finally, I've added the interaction with the Federal Aviation Administration. So we mentioned a few minutes ago with regards to the FAA placing a requirement that approaches to SFO airport were under instrument conditions, so using the instrument approaches. Now that may have contributed to this situation, and obviously I'm not part of the investigation, so I can't confirm that, but that would be one of the avenues for inquiry that I would pursue if I was involved in the investigation. If you like the video, please hit that like button, share it with your friends and colleagues, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. If you'd like to learn more about the CAST Accident Analysis method, I am actually putting together some online training. If you'd like to pre-register your interest, please click the link in the description. And if you have any comments or questions, I'd love to hear them, so please type them in the box below. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks a lot. Good night.